Alright, you guys asked me some questions, so let's answer them. First up, we got Stupid Man's Idiot, who asks, who is your favorite Lucky Star girl? It would have to be Cole Yasuka. Mostly, I just really vibe with her design and overall characterization. You know, she's got like messy blonde hair, and all her portraits in RGO are just really cheery and fun. Um, also, one thing that makes her stand out is that she's a second year student, not very common among Lucky Star characters. So that means she gets to be a senpai to characters like Hiyori and Patty, but also a kohai to characters like Honata and the protagonist. And of course, even within second year students, she's got Yamato as well. Um, Not in Rogaku no Otosai so much, but in other media where she's the same age of Surs, of course. Ko just has all these different dynamics. So you get to see all these different sides of her and the way that she interacts with the different characters, and it just really makes her stand out. Stupid Man's Idiot also asks, which Rogaku no Otosai opening do you prefer, PS2 or PSP? So it's probably not going to be much of a surprise, but the PSP version is my favorite. Mostly, I've just seen it so much more, compared to the PS2 version, so in my brain, I kind of just think of the PSP version as like the true opening, and the PS2 one's just like this weird other one that exists. But more objectively, I guess, or I really just feel like the PSP version does an overall better job at giving an idea as to what to expect from the game. The PS2 version's got that weird stuff with the slot machine aspect, or all sorts of stuff that's just not from the game itself. Whereas PSP version mostly sticks a lot more to like actual moments from the game. Another thing is that the PSP version has a cut CG from episode 3 featured in it that would have otherwise just not present in the game. So it's just like really cool. So if you want to know what that is, it's like an early version of Chun initiating Tsukasa into the Heal Drink Super selling scheme. Normally that takes place in the castle in the final game, but in this part of the opening, it's taking place in some town setting. And this town setting actually has backgrounds for it, or a background for it, in the game's files that, as far as I know, is unused. But there's no this specific CG of Chun and Tsukasa there, and the crowd and all that. That's completely cut from the game. So it's its only place it appears. That just makes the PSP opening like extra cool. So Ruran Blue asks, how did you find a way to search unused data in Rogaku no Otosai / Ravish Romance PS2? I got interested in searching them, but I found that all of them were encrypted. So this is something that I hope to answer in more detail one day, like maybe make some series of videos on this topic. But for now, the short and perhaps unsatisfying answer is I just reverse engineered the game's file formats. It took some guesswork and decompiling the game's code to kind of figure out what the game was doing with them. And then I just made custom tools to work with the game's files and then examine the contents. What I can say real quick, because again, I don't really want to go into full detail on that, it would be really long, and probably take a lot of diagrams and whatnot to show, is that the files aren't really encrypted. They're just in non-standard file formats, mostly proprietary Cryware formats. And of course, one thing you might be wondering now is, will you ever release your custom tools that you've made? And the answer is that I would like to. But the main reason why I haven't is just that they're very hacked together. They're not really very user-friendly. I'm sure that if I were to release them, either nobody would really use them, or the people that would want to use them would have all sorts of questions about how to use them, and all sorts of things they want me to add to them. And I just really am not interested currently in spending all that time to actively support them and actively make them user-friendly. But one day, hopefully not in the super distant future, that would be possible. Beginning of Time asks, are you Japanese? And how old are you? So, no, I'm not Japanese. I'm just some American guy who taught himself Japanese. As for my age, I'm 25 as of now. Darren Lubega asks, who's your favorite route in Haganai PSP? So admittedly, I can't really say that I have one right now. The Haganai PSP video series is actually me playing through the game for the very first time. So I kind of would just have to say by default that Kobatos is my favorite, because it's the only one that I've actually finished. The one I am looking most forward to, though, would be Yukimura's, and the reason for that is really just because she's my favorite Haganai character. Rika's is a close second, because she's my second favorite Haganai character, and there's some stuff that I know happens in the Rika one that are just like, I gotta know like the context behind those moments, because some of it is just like, wow, that's pretty crazy. So yeah. So Cristo asks, what made you choose RGO as the game to start translating? Did it have anything in specific that piqued your interest over the others? So honestly, there wasn't really so much of a deliberate choice to translate Rogaku no Otosai in specific. It was just kind of fate. Unlike a lot of people, prior to learning Japanese, I actually wasn't really all that familiar with anime, otaku culture. So I just wasn't really aware of that many Japanese exclusive games that I was interested in. Prior to learning Japanese, I did watch Lucky Star in order to initiate myself into that otaku culture. I had a friend at the time who was really into anime, and they liked Lucky Star, so I thought that was just a good choice, and it was an anime that I had kind of been passively aware of for a long time. So when I decided I would learn Japanese, random Lucky Star videos was just like some of the first purely Japanese content that I was watching at the time. And during that process, I ended up randomly one day coming across Rogaku no Otosai's the World of Long Play's playthrough of that game. And it just really stuck with me because it was like this early example of Japanese media that maybe I would like to try, but I would only be able to do it if I got good enough at Japanese. So cut to about a year and a half after I initially learned about it, I decided that I'm going to try and translate something as a project to improve my Japanese and get better at it. And so, Rogaku no Otosai was just the natural choice. Because even though I didn't even still at that time know all that much about Rogaku no Otosai, it was just that early memory of if I knew Japanese, I could play this game, and that's the only way I'm going to be able to play it, right? So my love for Rogaku no Otosai as a visual novel ended up coming from experiencing it through working on the translation. It wasn't really something that I had pre-existing appreciation for. In a way that actually made what Rogaku no Otosai had to offer just so much more special. It ended up teaching me a lot about otaku culture through the different references, and the way the game is just so ambitious and surprising. It takes Lucky Star in just so many unique directions that you wouldn't expect. It's just been such a joy to experience and share that with all you guys through the translation. Even though nowadays, admittedly, my love for the Lucky Star anime has kind of waned. I'm not as much of a fan of it anymore. There's just series that I think did things better than Lucky Star and so on. The Lucky Star games have, just kept that passion alive, that influential part of my Japanese learning journey close to my heart, right? So it's very special to me now, but at the time it was really just an arbitrary decision, or not arbitrary, but it was really just the logical decision because that was the only thing I really knew about that I was interested in. Akumari asks, what's the plan for the English patch for Rogaku no Otosai? Do you see yourself realistically working on it, or do you feel like the project is too daunting considering the size of the game? So, a couple of things to say with regards to this. First of all, it's worth noting that working on the video series is working on the patch. And I have been working on the video series fairly regularly. The video series, is the first draft for what will eventually be in the patch. So even though I recognize that working on the video series right now doesn't make the episode 2 patch come in sooner, but working on the videos does bring us closer to the patch being finished overall. Second of all, as time goes on, and I work on the video series, I get better at translating Japanese and just understanding Japanese. So hopefully that means that later episodes will be much faster to clean up the translation for and make them patch ready compared to these earlier episodes. Aside from minor adjustments here and there, I don't think episodes like 4 and onwards are going to take, that much extra effort. We'll mostly be able to just use the video translation for the most part. So I wouldn't take the long wait for episode 2 to necessarily be indicative of how long the wait for every episode is going to be. Episode 2 just happens to be a really tough episode that resulted in a really tough, not very good, rough translation the first time around in the video series. So it just needs extra special care to get it right. Third, answering your question more directly, my current plan for the English patch is that, work specifically like on episode 2 is not as high priority as working on the video series, but I am trying to make time specifically for it where I can, even if it's just I'm about to go to bed, but maybe I'll work on it for an hour. I've been doing that for the past week or so, and so I'm trying to get regular progress going again, even if it's not that much. And again, I just want to kind of reassure everyone that the patch is not canceled, it's not shelved. Making it TBD was not some oh yeah, it'll come out eventually, and then it never does. I fully intend to finish the patch, and it's not just something that I'm just making false promises on. It's just going to take time. Probably once the video series is done, I'll be more interested in working on it more full-time compared, there'll be more effort put into it when this video series is done. And the patch will be finished one day, and probably not as far off into the future as you would think. Silent Faye asks, what was your motivation to learn Japanese? So looking back on the time when I started wanting to learn Japanese, there was all sorts of different motivations, big and small. I think even one of them was I made a bet to my sister that I could learn Japanese, right? It wasn't the most serious one, but it was one of them. But if I really think about it, there was 2 core motivations here. The first was that I just in general had a desire to learn a foreign language just for the sake of knowing one. I had studied Spanish in high school for about 3 years. It was just this really awesome experience, learning how this foreign language is built up and seeing how it differed from English. But the problem that I ended up having with Spanish was that I just wasn't all that interested in the media and the cultural experiences that you can have when you know Spanish, which is a really big problem, because a language is more than just its linguistics, right? It's really that's only a really small part of what knowing a language is all about. Most of what knowing a language is all about comes from understanding the culture of the people who speak the language, right? So you have to actually be invested in those cultural experiences and media that's made in that language. So when I was thinking about a language that I could pick up that would be both interesting linguistically to me, but also culturally to me, Japanese just was the most obvious pick for me at the time. It's a language that's really different from English in all sorts of ways, the grammar and the writing system and all that. So from a linguistic perspective, it was really interesting to see how it was all going to come together. But I also knew that from a cultural perspective, Japanese culture was something that I could get into. I wasn't so knowledgeable about Japanese culture at the time, but I kind of had people around me and experiences around me that kind of told me Japanese seems pretty cool. I'd probably be into it. The second main motivation is closely related to that. It's something that I kind of already just mentioned, which is that I wanted to be able to have experiences in a foreign language that otherwise would have been inaccessible. I didn't know exactly what those things would be, but I knew if there was a language that they were likely to be in, it would be Japanese. Again, like I just said, I had at the time been more and more exposed to otaku and Japanese culture from people I was around at the time. Groups I was in. I was at university at the time, so it was in an orchestra that played anime music. So it just seemed like this really cool world that I wanted to become a part of, and learning Japanese, just kind of took off from there. Meatball03 asks, I wonder how you always catch every reference the games do to other series, because there are so many old early 2000s or 90s stuff. So as you can probably guess from my answers to previous questions, it's definitely not because I just happen to know all these things and I just like recognize all these references on site and it's like, yes, exactly, it was Lupin the Third, episode 32, right? You know, it's also definitely not the case, or it definitely is the case, that despite my best efforts, I still probably miss some of the references. One example off the top of my head, more recently, was that there's a Phoenix Wright reference in episode 2. I didn't recognize it when I first made the video, and at the time I translated that line of dialogue more literally, but in the patch I've accounted for it, and so now it's a Phoenix Wright reference. You know, so how do I manage to catch so many of the references that I, you know, even if I don't catch them all, how do I catch so many of them when I shouldn't, right? I don't know much otaku culture, or at least I didn't. I'm still learning a lot. There's two main methods. The first is that for Rogaku no Otosai, there's just a Japanese webpage that lists many of the references in the game. You know, that obviously helps a lot. You know, the second is that it's often the case that lines that are a reference to something will stand out. They kind of feel wrong. They're like, what in the world are you saying? Like, this doesn't kind of logically follow. You're kind of saying something a little weird, right? So when I kind of can detect that that's happening, I can do some research on the Japanese internet in search of answers, right? I'll usually like take parts of the line that I think are referencing it, you know, and Google in Japanese and kind of just scour the internet for answers. In either case, you know, even that reference page that lists all the references, or many of them, oftentimes they don't give that much detail about what it's actually referencing. So either way, it can usually take several hours to get to the bottom of one particular reference and figure out the best way to translate it. I usually do like to track down the exact way that some source material had been translated into English in the past as as a reference, you know, because if there's any hope of getting English speakers a chance to potentially recognize what it's a reference to, it will help a lot, you know, if I translate it the same way, right? Like with the Hunter x Hunter water divination, right? They refer to things like enhancers and transmuters, right? Like those are kind of terms that the official translation kind of decided on. You know, those words don't necessarily like translate into enhancer and transmuter, right? Like that's just one way you could translate it. But by picking those specific words, it will stand out better to people who are familiar with Hunter x Hunter. You know, this was one example of that, right? So doing all that's really like not the easiest task. But, you know, it is a lot of fun to learn, you know, all these new things along the way, you know. Like, again, like I just mentioned, the Hirigi Kagami dies twice reference that I made that's in part 164. You know, I ended up watching that Lupin the Third episode that it's referencing, and it's, you know, it's just like a really great time, you know. It's a lot of fun to watch that episode. Or in the episode 2 patch, you know, there's a reference to this moment from Yu-Gi-Oh! Where, you know, he's fighting some guy and he's like able to just continue to attack him as long as he keeps drawing monster cards over and over again. And, you know, Anzu tries to like stop him and he goes, Hanase! You know, and it's just like really fun. You know, I got a real kick out of like learning about that moment. That's referenced in episode 2, for example. So yeah, it's just a great time learning about all these things. But yeah, it's just a lot of effort, right? I just really like try my best to catch everything, or as much as I can. Even though I don't know all this stuff, you know, I do a lot of research. That's all I can say. Koricha-chan asks, how old are you and how much time do you usually spend on translation and all that stuff within one day? So again, I'm 25. As for how much time I spend a day on translation, it depends. I don't work on translation every day, you know, of course, but on the days where I do, it's usually somewhere between 4 to 6 hours, right? Like an episode of, or a part of Rogaku no Otosai, unless there's like weird reference that takes me down like a several hour rabbit hole, my pace is usually somewhere between like 3 to 4 minutes per hour. You know, for every 3 to 4 minutes of footage that you see, it takes like an hour of effort to make the video for it. If that gives you an idea. Haganai PSP parts obviously don't take as long most of the time because usually they're like 3 minutes or like less, right? They're very short. But yeah, Rollgaku no Otosai part usually can take like 6 or so hours to make one. Eric Does Everything asks, what/who exactly is your profile picture of? An OC? A character from an anime? So, it's an OC. Her name is Katsuko Noguchi. She was the protagonist of a novel that I was working on back in 2019. I ended up shelving that project mostly to focus on learning Japanese and later translating stuff. But, in that time that I was working on her story, I ended up really resonating with her, and she kind of has a special place in my heart. So she lives on as the mascot of the channel. My wife even ended up making a plush of her for my birthday one day, which is really nice. Looks really cool. So, yeah. I would like to probably come back to this thing and do something with Katsuko one day. Certainly, I'd like to make more drawings of her. These days I don't draw so much. I used to draw for like a decade prior to learning Japanese, but I kind of stopped. But I would like to make more drawings of her and the other characters from this story, at some point. But right now, I'm dedicated to working on translations, right? So we'll see. As a fun aside, another character from that novel happens to be called Yoshiaki Kubo. So if you ever wanted to know, like, where exactly did this Yoshi Kubo name come from for the RGO protagonist, it's the name of a character from the story that I had worked on. So maybe if it comes back, right? If the story comes back, we can tie in some sort of reference, right? That like Yoshiaki Kubo could be like, some reference to the fact that he is named after the protagonist from Rollgaku no Otosai rather than the other way around, right? Maybe there'd be some fun to be had there. Yeah, and there we have it. Thank you so much for asking all your questions. It means a lot, and I'll see you later.